Organizations, whether they're corporate or nonprofit or even government, want significant outputs and outcomes. They want sales, they want market penetration, they want increases, ROI in any investment. And that is reliant on the performance of the people who make that stuff happen.
I think a lot of performance management in retail is wasted on task management, not outcome management.
And if that's what the thought is, that's just wrong, and you're doing it wrong, so stop doing it wrong.
What comes first, the dollar allocations and then reverse engineer?
Oh, you want to know the secret?
Yes,
to
we
retail?
do. We're here.
Secret.
Typically, before we record any of these, I tend to go down a rabbit hole to see what experts and researchers are saying about the topic we're about to discuss. What I'm looking for isn't just validation, it's really blind spots. Because we've had the same performance challenges for years with no shortage of advice or research. So what's missing? Why hasn't it worked? Why isn't it fixed? What are we not asking or framing in a way that's helping folks make positive, sustainable changes? In doing that bit of research this week, something that stuck out to me about performance, about the employee life cycle stage of performance, is I had no shortage of reading or listening to do when I searched performance reviews. But I struggled a lot more to find information on performance management or a performance management strategy. So today, following our journey through the employee life cycle stages, we're talking about perform. All retail organizations care a great deal about performance, but not all are set up to support it. Some might even struggle to define it in a meaningful way, which kind of makes me laugh because as foreshadowing to this podcast and one recorded discussion Matt and I had, we were talking about performance at length, and at some point I was like, "When you say performance, what do you mean? Do you mean sales?" And it kind of came to light that actually that's kind of different from company to company, maybe even leader to leader, quarter to quarter. So in the context of the employee lifecycle, the perform stage focuses on driving expectations, providing regular feedback, and ensuring employees feel their performance is reviewed fairly. So it's about creating a clear path for employees to meet their goals, which should clearly overlap and contribute to the business goals, while also fostering a culture of recognition for good work. So simple enough, right? What I'm really excited about today, beyond just the discussion, we have our very first guest. And who better than Coby from Roman 3? I know James couldn't be here. Couldn't is generous. But hey, Coby, I won't. I hate when people ask me to introduce myself. So you're welcome to. I won't make you. But I will say that folks listening should definitely check out Roman 3's website and their work, their podcast, Diagnosing the Workplace, Not Another HR Podcast. It's actually how we met.
Right.
And leads a lot of, honestly, like my thinking and expanding our scope of work when we were working with companies. So, Coby, you have an extensive background in workforce and talent development and a master's degree focused on building workforce and community capacity.
Right.
So I say that in short to
Mm-hmm.
I think you fill an important gap that is certainly in my knowledge set for when the HR world gets a little bit too technical and more into the processes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that was a better opening I could ever give for myself, so thank you. But yeah, so largely the work that we do is we try to blend different models to help kind of navigate the HR landscape. So I mean, so my background again is kind of in education and adult learning and cognitive psychology. So I use those models to try and help improve the way that organizations improve their performance and their operational capacity. And my business partner James, who, like I said, in air quotes, wasn't able to make it. So he's a background in economic development and kind of business services. So that combination blend allows us to look at people and performance and culture and revenue, all this kind of stuff with a very, very different perspective and lens. So we're able to kind of help connect operational strategy to people strategy in a much more effective way because we have a much more robust view of kind of all the elements that fill it. And then we chat about that inanely and ongoingly, on our podcast, which again, wonderful that was a great kind of list for our first conversations. But yeah, so we're just a bunch of people nerds trying to kind of make sense of the chaos that is our modern workplace.
I love it. And what I love about that, so there's the combined strength of you and James, but then we get to partner with you too. And so to me, like the folks you're seeing or listening to right now is a really unique package specifically for the issues going on in retail.
Right.
Right. So that's, you've explained your focus area and how you work. Cato focuses a little bit more on the EVP, employer brand activation, employee experience design, internal comms universe. And then, of course, we have Matt, who has like the expert on the frontline experience. So honestly, like we really hope that in all of our work, he is like relentless and saying like, yeah, that won't work because, well,
absolutely, because again, all the stuff that, because again, we work a much broader scope than a lot of your focus on retail. We work with manufacturing and first level industries like fishing and farming, and tech, and in nonprofits and all kinds of that. So we work a wider range, and so a lot of our solutions we have to customize for the business sector realities of individual workplaces. So having the expertise of someone like Matt and say, yes, those are good, but because of the uniqueness of the situation, that needs to be adjusted, or that just flat out won't work, is very helpful in having us carve out the right solutions that will actually move the needle in the organizations that we work with. So the combination of that plus the way that we position and communicate, because communication is the grease that makes all the work that we do, and a lot of the work that the other organizations that try and support better employee experience and performance and outcomes and scalability, it is that grease. So the combination of your skill set, our background, and Matt's knowledge base really allows for a very effective way to kind of really come in with innovative and impactful and scalable solutions for retail businesses.
Amazing. So let's see what our brains can do together in the name of improving performance management in retail specifically. I'm probably going to be a little bit of a facilitator, moderator in this. That said, this is completely informal. Jump in, raise hands. Don't be afraid to challenge each other. I know this group isn't, and I also know this group is actually very good at being challenged and very receptive to amending mindsets and things like that. So let's see what we can do. I like to start with what always sounds like it's going to be a very simple question and rarely is. And this is the idea. I'll start with you, Coby. What's the point of a performance management process or system? What's the goal? What's the purpose?
Yeah, and that really seems to be the most important question. And the point of a performance management system, to be like to be a little bit pithy, it's about managing the performance of an organization, right? And one of the things that we often talk about when we go into any kind of company, large or small, is when we look at the performance management, we're like, okay, what is a performance management system? And they're like, well, it's this and that. I'm like, and they often kind of get to the point where like, we don't really have one. And I'm like, and we're often like, okay, so if you're not managing performance, then you're saying performance doesn't matter. Performance is a nice to have. When in reality, they're like, well, no, performance matters. I'm like, well, then why aren't you managing it? And this is really a lot of what it kind of comes down to, is the idea that the purpose behind it is about organizations, whether they're, again, corporate or nonprofit or even government, want significant outputs and outcomes. They want, sales, they want, market penetration, they want, increases in any ROI in any investment. And that is reliant on the performance of the people who make that stuff happen, whether that's in purchasing, whether that's in, in frontline direct sales, or even if that's in HR and kind of organization stabilization, whatever it is. performance is about outputs and outcomes. And if we're not managing how we meet those performance outputs and outcomes, what are we doing is really the actual question.
Okay. So then maybe done really well, what are the advantages of a great performance management system?
A lot of it is about measurable, sustainable, scalable results. So, I mean, if you're in a system where you're trying to, again, improve the growth of an organization, you can see that coming through effective intelligence and data and progression and continuous improvement and all these other things that allow for that to happen. Because I think the reality is, if you're not managing performance, and Matt, you can jump in on this point, then you're kind of like just doing daily operations with your eyes closed, hoping it's making a difference or hoping it's actually achieving something of value, but you're really not sure. You're just head down, focusing on the tasks and hoping it is making a difference or it's moving the needle in some capacity.
Okay, Matt.
Yeah, I also think for retail specifically too, in hearing you say all that, I don't know that I've ever really thought about it like this, but I think a lot of performance management in retail is wasted on task management, not outcome management. And so you spend all this time as, I'll just use store managers as an example. Well, I'll use store employees as an example. I'm managing, or I'm asked to manage all of these things that may or may not be important, almost micromanaging in a way. And then when I have my own sort of performance review, we're not talking about those day-to-day tasks. We're talking about like the outcomes. So there's a gap between what I'm being managed on and then what I'm turning around and managing my team on. Like if I was actually managing my team on the outcomes and we were all aligned in like, this is the goal, we'd see a whole different world of results.
And I think that is probably one of the most fundamental points, that if there's a highlight of this episode, it might be that point of the fact that we're confusing kind of task management and like people and outcome management. Because as a manager, our perspective when we go into organizations, we talk to like senior leaders and middle managers, is we often ask them, what percentage of your time is spent on people management and what is spent on task management? Because we often say the ideal scenario for most organizations to achieve the best outcomes is you want 60% of your time to be on the people and their outcomes and their outputs and helping them achieve their pieces, and 40% on carrying your own tasks. Where in the reality, a lot of organizations that we work with vary between 90 to 80% is on task and 20 to 10 is on people. And sometimes it's 100% on task and people is on the side of your desk. And that is just a failure as, that's being set up to fail as a manager if that's the reality that you work in.
And I imagine that's happening because it's easier to measure tasks. It's easy. Task compliance can become a surrogate for performance outcomes because that's a lot easier to track than to actually follow through in a timely manner and connect the actions to the outcomes, I think.
Well, it's also easier to train too. It's easier to train on technical stuff. It's easier to mentor and give lists and process on these are the tasks to achieve, and here are the steps by steps to do that. And it kind of goes back to one thing we talk a lot about, is the difference between complicated and complex. Complicated pieces are trying to, are about things that are multifaceted, multi-layered, often have a longer time to deliver on. But once you kind of figure out a path forward, you can rinse and repeat and it'll work over time. Like taxes are a good example. You do your taxes, they're very complicated, but what works for you will work for me, what worked for me this year will work for me next year. Where complex is kind of the opposite. Or in a sense, it's the idea that it's still multifaceted, still a lot of pieces, a lot of timeline, but just because you were successful in one capacity does not mean that you can repeat that, or what worked for Matt will work for me or whatever. So part of it is that that task completion is very complicated, but people management, people performance is complex. And complexity scares us because it's like you say, it's harder to track, it's harder to teach, it's harder to do, and it's doable. It's just harder. So we often want to default to what's simpler and easier to explain and easier to measure and easier to track.
Yeah, our damn humanness always complicating retail's attempt to maximum efficiency.
Absolutely. If it wasn't for those people, then they had.
So what we're saying is robots are the answer. Okay.
Well, and so what's funny is but don't forget the people are also on the purchasing side too. Now, the most effective way for retail to run is robots selling to robots. Then it's all complicated.
Amazing. Okay, so let's get into like a little bit of anecdotal. Like let's put this in context. Matt, do your reviews help you perform better as a store manager?
No. I think, I was thinking about this before we started the episode. Like I was thinking about all the reviews I've ever had in my career. And, you always get an annual review as a store manager. And I think pretty much every review I've ever had is one of two things. Either I'm surprised at how well I'm rated, or surprised that I wasn't meeting something that I should have been meeting. But either way, it's sort of a surprise. And not because like my boss and I'm thinking about it and I'm like, I've communicated with every DM I've ever had like once a week. And yet still there are quite a few times in my career where I've had the review and I'm like, oh, really? You're rating me that high? That's amazing. So I kind of suck. That's news to me. Tell me more. And I think, so they don't make me perform better purely because the feedback is too late. But also because then because you're not used to it if it only happens once a year. So then when it happens, you're like stuck with it for a while. And if you're me, you're like ruminating on it for quite some time.
Right.
Good or bad. I remember one time in particularly having a boss who gave me a great review. I was kind of surprised because I was shocked he was able to not be biased because I felt like we didn't have a great relationship. But afterwards, I just kept thinking like, why couldn't I just get this feedback in the day-to-day? Like I've spent many weeks thinking that maybe I should leave. Like maybe I shouldn't be here. All to find out I really should be here. But now I've already like half checked out.
Right.
And now I have to like check myself back in, and that's a hard thing to do. So I think a performance review has never made me perform better. It's only made me spend more time thinking and less time actioning things maybe I should be actioning.
So the sad part is, you know, the last thing you should ever experience in a performance review is a surprise. That's the last thing that a performance review should be a boring, mundane, just review of everything we've already talked about, nothing new. It should be just it should be a fairly laid back process because we've talked about all these things before. We're kind of just rehashing, old conversations because we're reviewing our performance management. We're not necessarily reviewing you and your performance. I think that might actually be where that disconnect comes from. They think, what are we reviewing? Are we reviewing you? And if that's what the thought is, that's just wrong, and you're doing it wrong. So stop doing it wrong, because you should be reviewing the performance process, the past conversations, all the things that we've already talked about. We're just kind of summarizing them and just making sure that that because of these conversations, we now know what we're doing going forward. And that is what we're reviewing, not the individual. And I think that maybe that simple understanding of what are we reviewing may actually be the fundamental breakdown in why we do them wrong so often.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the point that I made earlier, right? Like I had no shortage of finding information on the performance review conversation, but it was more difficult to find real formed info on the process.
Right.
So it might be interesting to try and unpack what I think, in my experience, are the common approaches. So when a company does have, because I bet you, like the companies we're talking about, these large national global retailers, I'm sure they have performance management processes. I'm sure there are 50 decks and 30 guides and tons of meetings. And I'm sure it is like brilliant in theory in those documents. But so why isn't it doing what everyone wants it to do on the sales floor?
So last question to you, Matt. How trained as a store manager are you in delivering performance reviews?
Well, now over the years, I mean, some of it has just been like learning through my own, what I don't like about my own. And then also there has been some formal training from companies, but I don't think it's something we focus a ton on, because I think one of the bigger things we haven't mentioned is also because performance reviews are so like tied into like some sort of merit increase. I feel like we focus more in retail on that part. Like, okay, so we're only giving Timmy 25 cents. So the conversation is going to be explaining to Timmy why he's only getting 25 cents. And then we're giving Sarah $1. That's like the most we ever give someone. So we really need to like explain to Sarah how lucky she is that she's getting a whole dollar. So I feel like that's where the focus is a lot of times in retail. It's not on the performance. It's on the like justification for the dollar amount. So you don't have people upset, or so you do have people who are appreciative of what they're getting, rather than like what
Well,
was
then,
the
but what is the
performance.
metric to assess the dollar amount?
I was going to say, what comes first, the dollar allocations and then reverse
Oh,
engineer?
oh, you want to know the secret
Yes,
to
we do.
retail?
That's why
Because
we're
that's
here.
the secret. So a lot of companies, I don't know that I've ever really thought about how messed up this is. So, so in a couple of companies I've worked for, and the three that I'm thinking of are Fortune, one of them might be a Fortune 100. Anyway, you rate your team on a scale of like, well, everyone was different, but like, let's say it's like a 0 to 5. And then you rate them in different categories. Then so for two of the companies, you submitted those ratings, and then you got back the document, and it had the money next to it based on what you rated your team. And then you wrote the review.
Wow.
Okay. I never else thought about the mess until I'm looking at YouTube, the reaction of YouTube. So let's say because also, and then in the third company that I'm thinking of, even more messed up, I decided the dollar amount, but I was only allowed to give, so I had a team of like 20, and I was only allowed to give, I don't remember the dollar amount, but let's say it was like $6 total as a raise across the board. And then I had to decide who was getting what. But the thing is if you make me rate people and do the dollar amount at one time, it's also going to bias me in so many ways. And like, I'm saying that as someone who actively like really tries to like, be like, okay, this is like, be objective. But if I if I have two really good performers and I know one, like, I don't know, is like from a wealthy family or something and doesn't need the job, and then I know someone else is struggling, it's really hard to not want to be like, let me push a little bit more money over here because that's going to help you. So there's that. But yeah, so I don't think there's no company I've ever worked for where you're writing a full review and then you're finding out how much money they're getting.
Okay. I feel like I was just taking the school there. So it's so funny because like a lot of the work that we do and go into companies is we do like we do a lot of like risk assessments and vulnerability identifications and everything like that. And man, like red flags are hugely going off in how much like risk that normal thing is creating for these companies. Because you're right, talk about like from like a labor standards perspective, the idea of like monetary favoritism, like labor code, is incredibly high. And just the subjectivity, and like, as again, how prepared, like how trained are you to actually properly evaluate the skills of the people that would go into the dollar figure, like, or guided on how to actually measure their performance. High performer, like, because again, is a high performer as far as they're very charismatic and they're very, and so they're noticeable, but maybe they're not actually any better performing, but they're just more upfront about it.
So there's also a couple of different things. So it's really complicated. So there's only one, just to be clear, because I'm imagining some executive at some company I've worked for. People are digging through my LinkedIn right now, being like, where are they? Just to be clear, there's only one company I got to determine pay for, and it was quite a long time ago in my career. Everyone else, it was you rated and the company determined based on your rating. Now, some companies were better than others in terms of how you could. Some companies are like, I hate the rule that's like, no one should be getting 5s. I'm like, then why is it on there? If no one should be getting 5s, why is it there? Then let's just go to 4. But then you're going to say no one should get a 4. But anyway, because then I have to explain to someone who's actually a 5, like, so no one can actually get a 5. But the other piece is some companies tie it to store results. So for example, let's say you work for a bigger company and you have a separate team, like you have a sales floor team and like a backroom team. Your backroom team can't get rated higher than your store's results for things that count as like backroom results, such as ship from store fulfillment, inventory completion time, et cetera, et cetera. So like they are measured by within that goal. So if you hit the goal, obviously your shipment team, some people could get really high because you've hit all the goals. But if you were in the middle, even if you have one person on that team who's like a superstar, you can't give them a superstar rating because the team did not achieve something worthy of being a superstar rating, which also complicates it. It's the same thing with the sales floor. If you're missing your, I'll give you an example. If you're missing your credit card acquisition goal, even if every other metric is amazing on your sales floor and you're rating a cashier, no company is going to let you rate that cashier in the highest tier because they'll be like, even if they personally might get a lot of cards, because like they're like, but your store isn't, so no one in your team deserves the highest thing. So that also complicates it. I mean, honestly, I think it's a lot. I used to, this is terrible, but I used to tell, like I had a transfer employee once at a big company and she was really upset because she was amazing. And I, basically told her that. And she was like, my review wasn't good. And I was like, listen, it's humans rating humans. And like, I just don't hold too much weight in it because I think it is a lot of like a lot of guesswork that happens, but also to your point about like training, and I'm really now thinking about like how trained am I in like actually rating? Not very. And also time is a factor. You get this Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is where you plug in these people's ratings and they're like, hey, it's due Friday by 10 a.m. And even if you send it on Monday, if I have a crazy week, I'm like, gosh, crap, I got to get that done. And I'm like, quickly, like, you get a 3.4, you get a 3.2. Oh, crap, I rated Tom 3.2 and Sarah 3.4, but maybe he should be a 3.3 actually. And then I'm rating them like against each other almost. So by the time I submit that form, sometimes I get it back with the money and I'm like, oh wow, I rated that person a 3.5. Interesting. I must have been having a good day that day.
And that is the thing that I'd be the most concerned. If you're having a bad day and like a bunch of people ticked you off, but it was like a rare occasion that one person did, that could impact their livelihood. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So because it's a one-off thing that has such a consequences. That's why that's why it should be so much more aggregate, right? Like again, these things should be done kind of like picked away at over time, not just being like, well, as far as my memory goes back in a retail, a day feels like a week. So you really want to go back a couple of days to go deep into your memory to remember stuff. And then, and then you're rating them based off that. It's not actually the performance. It's the examples you can pull off the top of your head because it's a one-shot deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Risky.
Well, I think, and I'm sure we're going to get to this. So apologies if I'm jumping the gun, but I've always been confused as to why it hasn't been more like, honestly, like a report card. Because I feel like when you're in school, you're not surprised by your final grade because you've had terms where you've like, well, I got an A and then I got a B. Oh, and then I struggled and I got a D, but I averaged out to a B plus because I got a whatever on the final. Like you have this idea of where you've been and where you want to go. And it's right there plainly for you to see. And I've actually only seen one company I work for do something like that. And it was only for store managers, not for the team.
The school thing's interesting because at least in later, like in high school afterwards, you're very clear on how you are being graded.
Right.
And it is objective. It is a score on a test. I mean, I guess you could argue in something like English, right? Like grading an essay might be a little bit different, but like I can see precisely what percentage of my grade is coming from which percentage of which test and stuff like that. I don't think in any schools have like a how you showed up. Like, did you follow the school values? Did you try and integrate if the behaviors you exhibited were complementary to our school's performance? So yeah, right. The tricky human thing, jumping in and complicating.
Yeah.
But so I have two follow-up questions based on what you explained about how you give performance reviews. So one, and we've touched on this a little bit, but like this idea of how are you trained, like what are you given, if anything, from corporate? And I mean, like, in terms of how are you trained, obviously in delivering and receiving feedback, but are you clear on what you are evaluating them against? Are you clear on like if the how matters or if it's just the outcomes?
So some companies, the how matters for sure. Old Navy, the how mattered. And so typically companies, they do give you like a rubric. They do give you like rating someone a 4 means this. It means, and some companies will get really specific about it, which I do like, where they'll be like, this means that 90% of the time they did this behavior consistently, blah, 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 blah. This score means X. So companies, again, there's probably going to be a lot of people listening to this. I'm thinking about how I'm trying not to I don't want to speak to a specific audience, but I'm sure there are a lot of former leaders of mine are like, oh, so you didn't care about reviews at all. But it's not. I just want to be real about we're given good tools. So I do want to give retailers credit where they deserve it. But we're not given the training to use those tools properly. And we're not given time to carefully consider the things. So we are given a rubric. It's not like I literally was blindly in the office, like 3.4, 3.5. Like I read the rubric, but did I have time to really go, pause, Tommy? And then in each category go, where does he really fit? And in actuality, I think, now that I'm saying this out loud, I think maybe it would be better served if rather than a score, we were actually just like drop down the behavior.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like if in every category I was able to be like, consistently performs blah, 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 blah. Because I think that would be less biased if I had no idea what that equated to in a score until like the end.
Right.
It's the scoring part that I think makes us biased. Because again, to your point, Coby, if someone is really charismatic and I like them, and they're like, as the kids would say, a personality hire, where they just bring the vibes, but their work is mediocre. But I see the score that mediocre behavior would give them. I might be like, ooh, but they didn't deserve a 2.8. They're like a 3.4. Like they're always the life of the party.
Right.
And life of the party is an on-net performance review.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What is that? Is that the halo bias, Coby? I know.
Yes, absolutely. That's
Yeah.
exactly what that is. And
Yeah.
so and the idea of we are painting them with the brush of their best qualities over their mediocre qualities, and always rounding up. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's a tough bias to achieve. But I think the other thing too is that there's also the fact of, if that person was really, did something nice to you, the 2 or 3 days before the review, that's fresh in your mind, that's even gonna add to the bias. Or if that person was uncharacteristically off their game,
Right.
because of life, then then there's a problem with that too. So it's combination of the subjectivity and not really training people on how to recover or deal with their bias, but also just, you've got one chance to do it. So I'm sure it's probably common that the staff in a lot of retails know when performance review time is, and are probably overly working hard and overly trying to plant the best experience into their leadership to get those pieces, because they know I only got to pull together for 3 days, once a year, and then and then I get a good rating, and then I get an increase. So there's lots of flaws to this
Yeah.
system. Holy cow!
Holy cow. Yeah. Well, and to your point about time, right? Like, not just to sit down and do these reviews, right, Matt, but like in the day to day, because we talked about that, nothing should be a surprise by the time you get to a review. And this is a management system. This isn't just a once annual, or however frequently a company does it, occurrence where this is the first time you actually get a chance to think about performance. So like in your day to day, it seems like a lot of store managers struggle with the time to talk about performance in a timely manner to address something that just happened.
Right.
My follow-up question to what you talked about how someone can't get a better individual score than their team score for something. Does that, I could see in some ways, in a really brilliant culture, that creating some level of accountability and support amongst the team. Like, hey guys, we got to raise our team score. That's how we all do better individually. I could also see in a less than stellar culture that creating a lot of resentment.
Yeah, I mean, I think, both. I've seen both too, for sure. Especially when it comes to someone who's really outperforming the store, essentially. And I think, no, some companies I was able to, you have to get special permission to give someone, and you need to come with a case of I would like to give someone, a 4.5, but supposedly I can only give them a 3.5 based on our results. Here's why they deserve it. And sometimes I've won those battles, but most times you can't. And I think in most cases, even in a great culture, I think it does breed a little bit resentment, because there's so many factors in retail. Maybe you have a shipment team, and the person who's a really great performer is also the person who wants to get to the next level. And the other 3 people have been there forever. But that person who's a top performer loves their peers. They just are working harder for a very specific goal in mind. And they actually kind of understand why their peers are not outperforming, because they're oh, they've just been here forever and they don't want to be anywhere else. They're happy. But then they get that score, and then they're oh, these people held me back. And so even in a culture where the team gets along and everything, it can lead to resentment for sure. I think it is companies' attempt at creating fairness.
Yep.
Right.
So that what they don't want, and it's been explained to us, I will give credit where credit is due. What they don't want is, I love my team and I'm just 5s across the board. But they all are terrible. And then down the road, there's some amazing employees, but that manager's really tough and doesn't grade them really harshly, and they don't get as high a grade as my team that stinks. So that's kind of them trying to figure out a way to create some, equity across the board.
And that makes sense, but to me, that's the wrong mechanism to create that equity. Training managers and how to effectively evaluate and shed their bias and truly manage performance is a much better way to ensure equity than trying to put guardrails in hoping that, hoping that people can figure out a way to do it without the training, which is really kind of what it sounds like. Because going back to the point that you made, Becky, about the in some cultures that performance cap could be good, but others bad. One of the ways that when we rebuild performance management, we often start with job descriptions and putting KPIs into individual jobs that build towards a team's KPIs, that builds towards the department's KPIs, it builds towards the store's KPIs. So what I'm doing every day and how I'm being measured for success is tied to how my team is, how the department is, how the store is. So it's very clear in how my actions are making a big difference. But what that also, so I would say there is value in tying performance to individual performance to kind of store performance and team performance, but that's mostly about identifying who is not performing, and then being able to then if it's a performance management issue, because that makes it very clear who's pulling the team down, and then it's not about punishing those that are putting the work in. It's about identifying those that are not, and then putting in a performance management process to improve their performance, so that way the team is delivering at their higher capacity based on everyone putting in higher quality work, better outcomes. So part of it is just, I think that my concern, Matt, is that the way that that's structured is a cop-out for actually training people to do or training managers to actually deliver effective performance management by just putting guardrails on what you can't do and hoping that that is a substitute for being able to actually effectively lead and manage people.
You just opened a whole can of worms about retail. That could be its own podcast series. Because I think you said that and I was like, wow, I actually think, just outside of performance reviews, not to get off topic, but retail has created a lot of guardrails to sort of get people and results to the place they wanted to get to, rather than just invest in training. Like, I think you've just described the bigger problem, that if that was fixed, this would be fixed. So that's like stuck in my mind now.
Decades of Band-Aids, right? Like just layers and layers.
Well, also like Band-Aids, but also like, I like the analogy of guardrails because it's really like rules and things not to do, and things that kind of like push you to like beat this metaphor to death. Into like one lane and hoping, okay, they can only be in that lane, so now we don't have to worry. Rather than just teaching us how to drive.
I think, like, Coby, maybe you can speak briefly to the idea of, you guys talk a lot about rules that empower versus rules that restrict, and this is a perfect scenario of that.
It absolutely is, yeah. So one of the things that is a part of the work that we do is we try and, again, recreate the way that organizations function by understanding the ways rules that empower and rules that restrict. So rules that restrict are about identifying what you can do. It's about that success can only look this way. This is the only way that you can interact, the only way that you can evaluate, the only way that you can do these things. Whereas rules that empower are actually the opposite. They're about saying what you can't do. You can't cross this line. You can't spend more than this without permission. You can't, be able to have this much time go before you respond to a customer need. But it's about identifying a much broader lane from the things that you have to avoid. Because if you identify all the things that are off the table, that means everything else is on the table. Whereas rules that restrict are saying the table is only this big and you can only act within this small, lane, as kind of going back to what you said, Matt. Because the other thing too is often how rules that restrict have value, like safety should absolutely be the only things you can only drive the forklift one way. That makes perfect sense, right? But the problem is we default to rules that restrict being the rules that govern, instead of creating autonomy and accountability and improving the way that organizations, manage their people, is by cutting off the things that they can't do, and then letting the judgment and letting the training and experience blossom by having everything else be options as long as you've removed the lines they can't cross. Because one of the things we talked about in one of our podcast episodes, we talked about using policies as weapons, and some of them are reactive. So like when, so I would say that a weapon of like oppression is the idea of, because a lot of managers were giving fives to everybody, they had to make a rule the fives are no longer allowed. Instead of addressing that manager that misused the policy and fixing that as a performance issue, they just said, okay, we're just going to kind of, sorry, not oppression, retaliation. We're going to use a weapon of retaliation and say that we're retaliating against all managers and say none of you can do fives now. And that's how we're reacting to this, instead of dealing with the actual manager that broke it. And that is Band-Aids on Band-Aids on Band-Aids, by really leaning into rules that were strict and trying to almost weaponize some of these policies as a way to almost make people not able to actually do the job effectively, but just make it easier to manage the rules themselves rather than actually manage the people.
Right. Yeah, and that's probably a reoccurring theme, right, Matt? Like, that's reminding me of all the broad stroke policy we talked about that have been put into place, right? Like, one person stole, everybody gets bag checks. Like,
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, it's funny that you say that too, because I have an employee now whose cousin works in corporate training, like in New York. This is anecdotal, but we recently had like a change at work that's so silly. It's a safety change, but it's still silly. And I was like, this is so silly. And he's like, my cousin always says when they create a rule, someone did something stupid.
It's like the do not operate while sleeping on your hairdryer, or like
yeah. And like we've told stories about like about our podcast about like people that have had like corporate cars. And they're for you because there's a lot of driving involved in the work that these companies do. This multinational corporation had like hundreds of cars leased, and families were allowed to use the cars on occasion within limited scope. But then one employee in Canada drove their company car to Florida, and then all family use of cars were banned. All mileage was better tracked, and everything was so much more regulated. Instead of punishing that one employee, they decided to punish all employees and weaponize those policies because they're mad that someone misused it. So now they're punishing everybody. And that is the sweeping change of what happens when we try to weaponize policies, because we're just all about using rules to restrict and taking things off the table and narrowing that lane, because it's simpler, but it's what hurts us in the end.
Hey, Future AI Becky here. Thank you so much for listening to part 1 of Performance in Retail. The conversation was so good, we had to split it into 2 episodes. So please forgive the seeming abrupt end and tune in to 2 weeks to hear the rest. Here's a sneak peek.
And that is just the reactive nature of just, instead of fixing actual problems by effectively managing performance, which includes proper discipline and all the other kind of stuff like that too, it's just easier to just weaponize a policy. Because employees are out to get us, we have to control, we have to retaliate, we have to oppress them in order for them to actually, not take advantage of our good nature. And that's really often the reality that we see.
Okay, I'm going to steer us back to performance management. It always does, Coby.
And this is why we need guardrails now.
It's such fair.
You're listening to Dear Corporate, Love Stores.